Welcome to True Crime Threads, where chilling secrets unravel one thread at a time. In today's case, we explore a haunting obsession that shattered a family from the inside out. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, the Reynolds family stood out as a symbol of stability and love. Patricia Reynolds, a 68-year-old retired school teacher, lived in a modest cottage surrounded by flower beds she tended daily. She had raised her daughter, Melissa, as a single parent after her husband's early death and took pride in the close-knit bond they had maintained through the years. When Melissa became a teenage mother at 19, Patricia stepped into the role of caregiver once again, devoting herself to raising her grandson, Daniel. Daniel grew up with two mother figures, his biological mother and his grandmother. Patricia was there for every milestone, from his first steps to his high school graduation. She helped him with his homework, packed his lunches, and Saturday front row at his school events. Neighbors often remarked how lucky Daniel was to have such a devoted grandmother. Inside the Reynolds home, Patricia's influence was everywhere, from the framed photographs on the walls to the little notes she left in Daniel's backpack for encouragement. It seemed like a home filled with warmth and genuine affection. As Daniel entered his teenage years, the bond between him and Patricia remained unusually strong. She spent more time with him than Melissa did, often insisting on picking him up from school even when it wasn't necessary. While Melissa worked long hours at the local clinic, Patricia made sure Daniel had everything he needed. She celebrated his smallest achievements and often gushed about him to anyone who would listen. Her pride in Daniel never wavered, and she rarely let him out of her sight when he was home. If he had sleepovers or went on school trips, Patricia would call frequently to check in, sometimes even showing up unannounced under the pretense of concern. Family friends admired Patricia's dedication. To them, she was the perfect grandmother, loving, supportive, and always present. But Melissa occasionally noticed moments that felt strange. Patricia would linger when hugging Daniel or insist on sitting next to him during family dinners, often touching his arm or brushing his hair from his forehead in ways that seemed more possessive than maternal. Melissa brushed it off, believing it was nothing more than a grandmother's deep affection. Daniel, on the other hand, started to grow uneasy. As he matured, he began noticing how his grandmother's attention felt suffocating. She would become visibly upset when he made plans without including her, and her mood would shift drastically if he spent time with anyone she didn't approve of. Still, Daniel never spoke openly about it. He didn't want to hurt her feelings, especially since she had done so much for him. He simply tried to avoid uncomfortable situations and spent more time out of the house. Despite these subtle red flags, no one in the Reynolds family suspected anything truly wrong. Patricia was still viewed as the glue that held everything together. Her home-cooked meals, her careful organization of Daniel's school projects, and her constant presence were interpreted as love, not obsession. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect household, a dangerous emotional entanglement was beginning to take shape that would spiral far beyond anything the family could have imagined. As Daniel moved through his late teenage years, Patricia's behavior began shifting in unsettling ways. Her affection, once seen as nurturing, turned into a form of quiet control. She grew increasingly involved in every aspect of his life, monitoring his friendships, commenting on his clothing, and even expressing disapproval when he styled his hair differently. She no longer masked her discomfort when he talked about girls at school or spent weekends away. What once seemed like a grandmother's concern began to feel more like jealousy, though no one around him could quite name it at the time. Patricia's possessiveness crept in slowly. She would leave notes in Daniel's room filled with dramatic language, expressing how empty the house felt without him. When he spent time with his girlfriend, Patricia would mysteriously fall ill, complaining of heart palpitations or dizziness. These health scares always occurred on days Daniel had made other plans. Out of guilt and confusion, he'd cancel his outings and come home, only to find her up and moving as if nothing had happened. She never explained her sudden recoveries, brushing them off as just needing him near. Melissa noticed her mother's increasing dependence on Daniel's presence, but misunderstood it as age-related anxiety. She reminded herself that Patricia had dedicated decades to raising both her and Daniel, and perhaps now, With Daniel growing up, she was feeling left behind. Melissa tried to encourage her mother to join local community events, go out with friends, or rekindle hobbies, but Patricia always declined. Her interest was fixed entirely on Daniel. Daniel, for his part, began to grow more withdrawn. He found it harder to maintain relationships with people his own age, because Patricia often interfered. If he was out too late, she would flood his phone with texts. If a girl called him, Patricia would question him about her, sometimes making inappropriate comments that unsettled him. He felt watched, even inside his own home. At times, he caught her standing silently in the hallway outside his bedroom at night. She would claim she had heard a noise or was checking on him, but the explanations never seemed to feed. He began to avoid the house altogether. When he wasn't in class, he would spend time at the local library, at his girlfriend's place, or with friends. Patricia didn't take his distance lightly. She responded with emotional manipulation, sending him long messages about how much he had changed and how hurt she felt being shut out. Daniel wanted to confront her, but he didn't know how to put his discomfort into words. There was no clear boundary. She had crossed only a series of small, disquieting incidents that added up to something he couldn't ignore. Melissa tried to support him, suggesting he focus on school and his own space, but she didn't see the full extent of Patricia's behavior. Patricia was careful when others were around, reverting to her usual calm, grandmotherly self. She cooked, cleaned, and smiled through conversations, hiding the obsession growing beneath the surface. Her fixation, once dismissed as overprotection, was becoming something more dangerous. Daniel's instinct to pull away only deepened Patricia's emotional dependency, creating a pattern that neither of them could break. The cracks were widening, but the family had yet to grasp how deeply rooted the obsession had become. Everything changed after Daniel's 20th birthday. By this time, he had moved into a small apartment shared with a friend near the college campus. He visited home occasionally but kept his distance from Patricia, sensing that space was the only way to manage the discomfort he couldn't quite explain. Melissa continued to visit her mother regularly, helping with errands and organizing household items. During one such visit, while packing boxes for storage, Melissa came across a worn leather-bound journal tucked beneath old quilts in the linen closet. Thinking it might contain childhood memories or recipes, she opened it without hesitation. Inside were handwritten entries, but they weren't recipes or family anecdotes. As she flipped through the pages, Melissa's face went pale. The content was deeply disturbing, pages filled with obsessive thoughts about Daniel, written in an intimate and romantic tone that crossed every imaginable boundary. There were entries describing him in unsettling detail, entries recounting moments they shared but twisted through a delusional lens of desire and longing. Melissa sat there frowning, struggling to accept what she was reading. As she turned more pages, the content only grew darker. Some entries referred to imagined scenarios that had never occurred, and others described Patricia's jealousy when Daniel spent time with girls his own age. Among the pages were letters addressed to Daniel, never sent, written as though he were a romantic partner rather than a grandson. The handwriting was shaky at times, yet the words were deliberate. Melissa felt sick. Her mind raced between disbelief and horror. Until that moment, she had convinced herself her mother's behavior, though overbearing, was rooted in love. This journal revealed something else, as something dangerous and deeply wrong. She closed the book, unable to read more, and immediately left the house with it in her hands. Melissa confronted Patricia the next day. The confrontation was tense and brief. Patricia reacted with fury, insisting Melissa had no right to go through her personal belongings. She accused her daughter of betrayal and refused to explain anything written in the journal. Her anger spiraled quickly into denial. She claimed the entries were misinterpreted, just dreams, just nonsense. But her defensiveness spoke louder than any words. Melissa didn't push further. She already knew the truth. She told Patricia that Daniel would no longer be returning to the house, and left with the journal in her bag. After the confrontation, Patricia's behavior took a sharp turn. She stopped answering calls and refused to see visitors. Days later, she was briefly admitted to a psychiatric facility for evaluation, but during her stay, She barely spoke. The doctors, unable to diagnose her without cooperation, discharged her after a short period. Melissa had hoped the journal would be enough to take legal action, but since no physical crime had occurred, there were no grounds to intervene. Daniel refused to press any charges or report the contents formally. Overwhelmed with shame and confusion, he wanted it buried. He blocked Patricia's number and avoided any places she might visit. Patricia, now cut off from the person she was obsessed with, withdrew into herself. On the surface, she remained quiet, but internally, the obsession hadn't disappeared. It had simply found a place to grow in silence, unchecked and undisturbed. The family hoped distance would heal everything, but they didn't realize that silence often feeds what is meant to die. Months passed, and life seemed to settle into a fragile routine. Patricia, after her brief hospitalization, appeared more stable. She resumed simple daily habits, tending her garden, attending a local book club, and exchanging polite greetings with neighbors. From the outside, she looked like a woman quietly aging in peace. She even began sending occasional handwritten letters to Melissa and Daniel. The letters were calm, apologetic, and filled with phrases like, "I'm healing now," and "I only want to be forgiven." She never mentioned the journal or the confrontation. To Melissa, the sudden calm felt unnatural, as if something were being rehearsed rather than resolved. Despite her instincts, Melissa cautiously allowed Patricia limited contact with the family. They met only in public places, and always with others present. Patricia behaved well during those meetings. She brought cookies, asked about Daniel's studies, and spoke of the weather. There were no visible signs of the obsession that had once taken over her life. Daniel, however, remained distant. He had moved on with his routine, focusing on college, work, and time with his girlfriend. He no longer visited his grandmother, choosing to keep his boundaries firm. One evening in late autumn, Daniel received a letter from Patricia. It was different from the previous ones. It was short and uncharacteristically casual. She had invited him to her home for dinner, saying she had found some of his old childhood things and wanted to return them. The letter included no emotional appeals, no guilt, no pressure, just a simple request. Against his better judgment, Daniel considered it, perhaps, after all this time, a visit could bring closure. He told no one of his decision and drove to her house the following Friday evening. He never returned. When Daniel failed to answer calls or show up for a scheduled shift the next morning, Melissa grew alarmed. She contacted his roommate, who confirmed he had mentioned visiting Patricia. Melissa rushed to the house. The lights were off, the curtains drawn, and no one answered the door. She called the police. When they arrived and forced entry, they discovered a scene no one could have imagined. Daniel's body was found in the guest bedroom. The bed had been made up with silk sheets and surrounded by candles. A faint scent of perfume filled the room. He was lying on his back, fully clothed, with no visible signs of struggle. Toxicology would later reveal a lethal mix of sedatives in his system. In the adjoining room, Patricia was found unconscious on the floor, an empty pill bottle beside her and a framed photo of Daniel as a child clutched to her chest. She had attempted to end her own life, but survived. The scene was carefully arranged, as if Patricia had been preparing for this moment. The setting resembled a honeymoon suite more than a grandmother's house. Investigators noted the deliberate staging, the eerie calm of the rooms, and the absence of panic. Patricia was taken into custody once she regained consciousness. She offered no resistance, no explanation, and no remorse. She simply stared forward, saying nothing, her face devoid of expression. What had been seen by the world as quiet love had revealed itself as a calculated, tragic obsession that had finally turned deadly. As the investigation unfolded, layers of Patricia's life began to unravel in disturbing detail. The house where Daniel died was treated as a crime scene, and detectives searched every room for evidence. They collected notebooks, photographs, personal items, and digital devices. It didn't take long to uncover a chilling trail of obsession that had quietly evolved into a dangerous delusion. Patricia had kept not only handwritten journals, but also a hidden folder on her computer filled with disturbing, content letters, altered images, and graphic digital artwork that portrayed her and Daniel in fabricated scenarios. The files spanned several years, indicating her fixation had been growing steadily, hidden behind a facade of grandmotherly care. Forensic analysts recovered dozens of unsent emails addressed to Daniel, each one more intense than the last. Some were filled with poetic longing, while others hinted at plans and desires that had no place in a normal family relationship. Investigators also found photographs Patricia had edited, placing herself and Daniel in locations they had never visited together, sometimes holding hands, sometimes in romantic settings. The digital evidence confirmed that Patricia's obsession had fully replaced her grip on reality. Psychological experts brought in to review the case identified her condition as a rare and extreme form of erotomania, where a person falsely believes that someone, often of higher status or close relation, is in love with them. What made Patricia's case more disturbing was that her obsession targeted her own grandson. This form of delusion, paired with isolation and years of emotional dependence, had built a fantasy that Patricia believed entirely. In her mind, Daniel belonged to her in a way no one else could understand. She saw his distance as betrayal and his relationships with others as threats. The legal process moved slowly. Patricia was declared mentally unfit to stand trial after psychiatric evaluations concluded she lacked awareness of the crime's moral and legal gravity. She was committed to a secure psychiatric facility indefinitely. She refused to speak during interviews, therapy sessions, or court proceedings. She spent her days in silence, occasionally sketching scenes from a memoir, most of them featuring Daniel. She never expressed guilt or sorrow. In her mind, she believed she had simply fulfilled what had always been destined. The case shocked the town of Willow Creek. Neighbors who once praised Patricia's devotion struggled to reconcile the image of a kind, elderly woman with the reality of a predator cloaked in affection. Daniel's death became a tragic reminder that obsession can take root in the most unexpected places, and that unchecked behavior, even when subtle, can evolve into something irreversible. Melissa, devastated by the loss of her son and the betrayal by her mother, chose to leave town. She sold the house and relocated, hoping to rebuild her life somewhere untouched by the shadows of the past. She never visited Patricia again. The journal, the letters, the photos were locked away, hidden from the world. Daniel's story remained a quiet scar in the memory of the town, whispered about but rarely discussed openly. The tragedy served as a grim example of how love, when twisted by delusion and control, can end not in comfort or closeness but in silence, grief, and irreversible loss.